If you're building up to a big race, you're returning from injury, or you're starting a new sport, there'll be plenty of science and evidence-based research for you to tailor your training. So what if you're building up to a rather large life and body-changing event? Where is the guidance then? Well, if you haven't guessed yet, I'm talking about pregnancy. I'm not afraid to admit that a few months ago, I was totally clueless and I found some rather conflicting and somewhat discouraging answers. So I reached out to experts and those with first-hand experience, and I must admit, I have got some interesting insights from an Olympic champion, a women's health physio, and a pre- and postpartum personal trainer, and I feel it's only fair to share that knowledge with you. Whether you yourself are pregnant, you're coaching someone who is, or you and your partner hope to get there one day, I want to share what evidence and guidance that I can find. And obviously, it's a slightly personal mission too. But first, is it okay to name drop? Well, excuse me, I am doing it anyway because we have triathlon Olympic champion Jess Learmonth, who's going to be talking through her recent pregnancy and how she adapted her training throughout it. I am very aware, though, that we are not all Olympic champions, and every pregnancy and every woman's experience is also completely different. So with that in mind, I'm also going to be hearing or speaking to two experts in the field who've been instrumental in my pregnancy journey so far. I don't know about you, but I'd like to say I'm pretty familiar with the muscles that we use in our day-to-day training. And as I've had more friends who've had babies, I have become aware of this phrase, pelvic floor, but I didn't know much more than it was a muscle, didn't know what it looks like, or the fact that it isn't as simple as the stronger the better. Well, obviously, I am out of my depth on this topic, so I have brought in the expertise of Nikki Hurst from Thrive Pelvic Health to help me out.
So our pelvic floor is just, like I said, the base of our pelvis. And if you can imagine, it sits here. To make up our deep core, we also then need to include our diaphragm here and our deep tummy and our back muscles. And that makes what we sort of call our core cylinder. Pelvic floor at the bottom, diaphragm at the top, and then muscles that wrap around. And they work together. As you take a breath in, your diaphragm goes down. And at this point, the pelvic floor should relax. When you breathe out, the diaphragm lifts up and the pelvic floor again should lift up. So they kind of work together in this way. So when you're exercising, or say doing weights or anything like that, we really want you to exhale with the effort of that movement, because then you're going to get a better recruitment of that deeper core.
So with it being a muscle and all the other muscles that we work and we train, is it about being as strong as possible to make sure that our pelvic floor is functioning well?
Not so much in the pelvic floor. So we want it to be strong, but we also need it to be able to move through its full range of movement, as you would with lots of other muscles in your body. So with the pelvic floor, we want you to be able to squeeze and lift the pelvic floor, but we also really need you to be able to relax it. And that's, again, equally important in pregnancy, because especially in your third trimester, where the emphasis really should be on making sure that you've got length in your pelvic floor in preparation for birth.
Well, we'll come back to Nikki with how and when to strengthen those new muscles that we've just discovered. But what about the muscles that we are familiar with, those that allow us to swim, bike, run, jump, hike, etc.? Should we treat those any differently? When should we start to adapt our normal training? How much training should we do? What are the signs that we should make any adaptations? What are those adaptations? So many questions. So it's time to pop across the pond. I mean, if only we could actually fly over to the States. The budget doesn't quite stretch that far, but thanks for Zoom. I'm going to be speaking to Brianna Battles, who is a specialist in athletic training for athletes that are pre- and postpartum.
Especially during pregnancy, I think you have to have a really adaptable mindset to your training, because as athletes, we're really used to following process, following a plan and sticking to that plan. And then during pregnancy and postpartum, there's just a lot of variables that are outside of our control. But exercise is one of the things that is within our control. So how we approach exercise and the relationship we have with our body, the relationship we have with our training, all of those adaptations have to start first with adapting the mindset. I talk a lot about athlete brain. And especially athletes in the endurance communities, they can really relate to the mindset of we are used to pushing through, going harder. If there's pain, well, I just got to keep going. Or if I have 0.3, I got to take it to 0.5 or whatever. You can't there's very rigid approaches to training, and that's what fuels us. And that is athlete brain, is that ability to push and be really driven. And that helps with our success. And during a season like pregnancy, for example, there are so many changes to our body. There also has to be changes in our approach to training so that we are really able to pursue this lifetime of athleticism. It's not just about how much we're able to do during pregnancy or how fast we're able to get back postpartum. It's about our ability to keep competing and training in the ways that are really fulfilling for the rest of our life, or as long as we want to do that. And so that's why we don't really want to push all these boundaries during seasons that are so physiologically and psychologically different.
And so how, I know you're going to say like every athlete's different, and obviously that's the beauty of if people get to work with you directly, but for some general advice for our viewers, what kind of guidelines can you look for when it comes to both lifting and running? I think that's the majority of our viewers with that. And yeah, is there anything you can kind of give us as a way to sort of, as a take home?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start with lifting. I think lifting is really key for triathletes in general, but especially during pregnancy where your volume of endurance training isn't as high, or maybe it's not as intense as it normally is. So this is a really great time to embrace cross training. And sometimes I know there is some resistance to that, because I think if you're a triathlete for a reason. You don't really want to lift. Like, you want to be doing swimming variations, cycling, running, and then things that complement those different levels of output. So, but we fundamentally know that resistance training actually helps us become better at running, better at cycling, better at swimming. It's just not as enjoyable. So I think this is a really great opportunity to embrace more strength training. And you can do it in a circuit kind of manner so that you are getting your heart rate elevated if you're not really getting that as much of that fix during pregnancy with your endurance training. And knowing that like you are helping your joints and your muscles and your tissues not just manage pregnancy, but you're setting yourself up for an improved postpartum recovery if you can strength train during these seasons. Now, that's not to say that we need really heavy lifting, because I think once we, like in our CrossFit community or powerlifting communities, we're used to like really heavy lifts, Valsalva, where you hold your breath, and that causes a lot of pressure and a lot of tension on the core system and the pelvic floor. So we're not doing that. But I think in the triathlete community, honestly, just basic resistance training, loading the body where it's not really heavy, you're not having to grind through the reps, but you are loading your joints. All of that is really beneficial. And there's things we can do to adapt how much pressure and tension needs to go into that system with timing your breath, just kind of paying attention to what your tendencies are. I think a lot of triathletes are high tension humans, which relates back to that athlete brain. So they might hold a lot of tension in their traps. They might really grip their abs. They might really squeeze their butt all the time naturally. That's their baseline posture or their baseline movement pattern. So I think it's learning to down train some of those muscles that hold a lot of tension. And we can do that actually through strength training, where you're working through that full range of motion and you're not having to create so much tension at the end of the repetition. So it's a good way to dial in movement patterns, create body awareness, and complement the sport that you're doing.
Whilst we're still on the strength training portion, just a little bit on the breath. So what should you be thinking about with your breathing when you're lifting relatively heavy?
Yeah, I think a really simple way to think about this without really overcomplicating it is you just don't really want to hold your breath that much during pregnancy. When you add that breath hold, you're creating more intra-abdominal pressure, and that puts more strain and stress on the midline tissue and down into the pelvic floor. So you can either exhale through the full range of motion for some movement patterns. You could do an inhale down, exhale up. When in doubt, you just kind of want to breathe through your movement. And you don't need to be lifting a load that's like super challenging. It can be challenging, but you shouldn't be like really struggling. It shouldn't be, a really high percentage of your 1 rep max or anything like that. You will still get benefit from just loading your body, loading your joints, and doing it in a way where you're able to train that quality range of motion.
Thank you for your wise words. I don't know if there's anything else you feel would be useful to our viewers to think about in their journey whilst they're pregnant.
Yeah, well, I think to maybe give some more tactical ideas for navigating running for those that do want to keep running or they feel pretty good. I think incorporating more incline, whether it's hills or incline on a treadmill, that can be really positive because that puts you in a position of a slight forward lean And that's less stress to the pelvic floor by simply shifting that position. It involves the glutes a lot more. So I think that's a really great tactical way to kind of drill a healthy movement pattern without compromising the pelvic floor as much. And then doing like intervals, but not in the sense of sprinting intervals, doing more like bouts of like running. So it's shorter duration. It's not as much continual repetition and continual stress of the pelvic floor. And then there's a way to kind of like reset and downtrain the pelvic floor and then, you know, repeat that process. So you have a lot more awareness and ability to check in with your body. If you want to keep running, it's not like go run 10 miles. Well, you can just go on autopilot and keep going and going. But again, we're looking at the sum of our habits, the sum of our choices, the sum of these patterns we're putting on our body. Think about how many steps are involved in running 10 miles. Like that's a lot. It's a lot of volume on a changing body. That's a lot of volume of reinforcing a new gait. And I think so many of us, whether it's, you know, in triathlon or any other sport, we've trained our whole life to dial in our form, or for you guys, dial in your gait and really like take ownership of our mechanics, because that's what makes us great in our sport, great in our activity, or really efficient. During pregnancy, it's very easy to adapt new patterns, and it takes away from what we've tried to reinforce prior.
As you can see, my run has become a bit of a shuffle, and I will admit it's been a battle. I've listened to the recommendations and I'm not sure if I've got it right, but I've made my own informed decision on this matter. But it's about looking at the bigger picture, and I almost hate myself for saying that because so many people have told me this, and I have shouted at most of them, or in my head at least, saying, you know, you don't understand, I can't not run for X amount of time. But if you right now are listening to me saying that and shouting at me, I totally empathise. Well, that whole listen to your body advice is really hard to get your head around, especially if you've been training or used to training for sports when you basically tell your body to shut up if you're training really hard and you've got to push through. You're used to that. So it's total change of mindset, and one that I found really quite difficult to get my head around. And it's time to hear from Nikki again, because she explains really well those signs to look out for and those timings of maybe when you do need to just back it off a little.
So again, in pregnancy, we know exercise is good for everyone, really, and we don't want you to stop when you don't need to. However, if you are experiencing any leakage of, like we said before, urine, poo, or gas when you don't mean to, and especially sort of if you're running, or if you sort of cough, sneeze, laughing, then that's a sign that your pelvic floor is under a bit more pressure than it should be. Again, also, if you get any heaviness or dragging into the vaginal area, and if you experience any sort of, if you're starting to get any pelvic pain, or when you run, if you start to just feel uncomfortable and it's not a good feeling, and you can sort of, it's a bit of a grey area, but when you talk to a lot of runners, they say, no, I just felt too much pressure there, or it just didn't feel comfortable anymore. And that's sort of when they'll change and switch to something else.
And it feels like, speaking to different athletes who've been through pregnancy, that it's so different for each person. But is there any kind of vague protocol of like when you should run, when you shouldn't, when it's during pregnancy?
Again, it's a bit of a grey area. There's loads of research going on at the minute in terms of what women can do whilst they're pregnant. Initially, or sort of if we go back a few years, women were always told maybe go to more low impact or don't do as much strength training. But actually, strength training and aerobic training are really recommended now, and we kind of want to be led by that person. I would sort of say bring in more cross training. That's what I recommend to my patients. So especially in your third trimester, bring in more cross training, because you do have that additional weight from baby and bumps. So if you can keep up bits of running as long as it's comfortable, you're not getting any signs and symptoms, but bring in other forms of cardio exercise and maintain your strength training and your mobility training too.
Okay, and so now back to the bit that you sort of obviously do specialise in and there's more evidence on, is how to actually strengthen your pelvic floor. What should we be doing and how do we know if we're doing it right?
Okay, so where we've shown on the pelvic floor previously, and you know sort of it covers this big area at the bottom of your pelvis. So the cues which I often use with patients where they can really connect with their pelvic floor initially might be as simple as, on your breath out, can you squeeze your anus, or can you imagine that you're stopping wind? Okay, and that will get all this back portion of pelvic floor muscles, and hopefully you could feel a squeeze and a lift, breathing normally, and then when you want to, let go again. To get the portion of the pelvic floor a bit higher up, cues such as imagine that you're stopping a wee can really get these front portion of the pelvic floor muscles. And for the central part, sometimes cues as simple as imagine that you're squeezing and lifting a tampon. Okay. So it's almost breaking it down into those sort of key components and then bringing it all together so you can test that yourself. To check if you're doing it right, again, you can either feel for that feeling of that lift and that lower. So on a firm chair, you might feel like that perineum, so the skin between the vagina and the anus lift up and then lower down. You can also lie on your side and just bring your hands round the place on this bit of skin as well, so that when you sort of breathe out, activate your pelvic floor, it should lift away from your fingers and draw inwards. And then when you relax, it should come back onto your fingers evenly. And the last thing, really, you could look in a mirror. So again, in your own privacy, just looking at the vulvar region, aim to do a pelvic floor lift. Watch what the perineum does. So it should lift up and in when you do it. And then as you relax, it should just go back to that starting position.
How often should you be doing these exercises? When do you start them? Does that stay the same the whole way through your pregnancy? Like, is there a little bit of a protocol with that if people are new to this and going, okay, that sounds cool, but do I do that every day? Do I do it every hour? Do I just do it the last few weeks?
Yeah, so ideally we should be doing them daily. And I think we should ideally sort of be looking to first connect with the pelvic floor and make sure that you can feel that lift and you can feel that lower. Everyone's prescription of pelvic floors might be different. So as long as you can feel the lift and you can feel the lower, then ideally I would start off with maybe doing 8 repetitions for sort of an 8 to 10 second hold, and then a few short ones to finish. And that's sort of building up strength and building up awareness of the pelvic floor. When you're in your 3rd trimester, you can still carry that on, but we want to make sure as well that you're really letting go of the muscles, and that might come into some exercises that we go into later as well.
Well, as you can see, there is a lot to consider, and I found that listening to all of the different perspectives is the best way to make your own decisions. Well, on that note, I feel it's time that we hear a really positive pregnancy story from an athlete. And I don't think Jess Learmonth needs much of an introduction. Well, Jess, thank you for joining me. I gather just from sort of following online that you had a fairly smooth pregnancy, but can you just talk a little bit about how your pregnancy was as an athlete and how you managed to kind of balance your training with that?
Yeah, sure. My pregnancy was a dream pregnancy. I hate to say it, and I always thought I was jinxing myself through my pregnancy that I was going to have the baby from hell because everything was just going too well. And I was quite lucky. I was able to train right up until birth. My training structure didn't change that much. I was able to stay pretty mobile and do a lot. So yeah, it was probably the perfect pregnancy. I think the only time I had a slight issue was probably the first few weeks, maybe the first 12 weeks. I was just extremely fatigued, but I think everyone's like that. But on top of that, I was still doing like 30 hours a week, which was probably the reason for my fatigue. But yeah, I think after that, everything just got better and better really until probably the last 2 weeks of my pregnancy where I felt very pregnant. And then the birth was also quite good, really. So I feel like a right big head talking about it, but I just think I've been really lucky.
I mean, like I've said throughout this video, everyone is so different, and it's just really nice to hear a really positive story as well. But what guidelines were you kind of following, and do you have anyone there sort of to help guide you with your training and how to adapt things?
Yeah, quite a lot, to be honest. I mean, I was very lucky that Vicky Holland had just literally done the same thing 6 months before, so she kind of paved the way and set the standards really in British Triathlon. And I have a lot of guidelines that they give you, which they follow from obviously all the research that's been done, and they do that every 4 to 6 weeks. They just give me like the update of the guidelines. So I followed those, and also I was with the female health doctor at Bisham Abbey. And she kind of kept an eye on my bloods and also let me know of any like research that they did. And like I'm sure you've probably found out yourself, there's not much research out there. So I had to do a lot of kind of self-guidance as well. But I kind of took what I wanted from the research and then kind of just went by feel, basically. But I think probably the main one that I stuck to was making sure that I didn't go above 85% of my max heart rate, and I did that from 12 weeks onwards. So that was probably the main thing that I followed, really, and then just other bits around it.
And what about heat? Did you have any times you had to be careful with that, or were you just training in the UK so it wasn't a problem?
Most of the time I was in the UK, but I actually went to Japan when we were like 28 weeks, and there was a couple of times there that I got very hot. I actually remember walking back and getting an not Evian, the sparkling water. I can't remember what it's called. It begins with P.
Perrier water.
Oh, yeah. And I would just like showering.
Feeding yourself.
Like it was loaded, just like having a shower.
Yeah, as one does.
So that's how you cool yourself down if you get too hot in Japan. Just get some cold sparkling water from the vending machine. But yeah, there was a few times when I was abroad that I kind of had to make sure that I kind of sat down and didn't get too hot. So I also went to France as well at 36 weeks. So again, I had to just be careful while I was running out there. But I've done that much heat prep before Tokyo that I feel like I know when my body's hot and not. So I had kind of an advantage there, but most of the time it was fine, because obviously. And
what about, so you talked about your intensity using your heart rate, but what about actual total mileage and hours? I mean, I'm guessing you weren't quite still doing 30 hours a week by the end of your pregnancy, but what did the ratios look like between the three sports, and how do you kind of balance and reduce it?
I think nearly all the way up until probably I went to France, so that was like 36 weeks. I was still doing about 20, 25 hours a week. I swam most days, so like Monday to Friday, and then ranging from like 60 to 90 minutes. And then I just tried to ride probably similar or 4 times a week. Again, towards the end, it was mainly on the turbo, but I often went out on the mountain bike just off road. And then running, I kind of just kept it to like 4 times a week. But I was still doing up to like an hour, 50 minutes while I was in France before I came back and did my calf. But yeah, so in terms of actual volume, it didn't reduce that much at all. It was just the intensity that was a lot different, and obviously that was a long time to not do intensity. And the only intensity I did was in the pool, and that was just 50s or threshold. And I don't know if they have like a polar heart rate monitor, and the coaches have like an iPad. So like if we were doing hundreds and stuff, they'd be like, Jess, you're going to have to stop. So they'd monitor it. So it was quite useful, really, that I could keep an eye on it that way as well.
And what about the sort of strength and conditioning elements? Did you do a bit more of that? Did that change at all?
Well, I was quite heavily into the gym at the time, because I was strengthening my hips from a hip injury, which is probably not the best thing to have prior to getting pregnant. Although it could be, because I was obviously working on my pelvic health, and I was doing probably gym 2 or 3 times a week. And I didn't actually reduce that, I just maintained it. So the weights were pretty much the same. I was still doing really heavy weights, like literally the Friday before I gave birth. I can't remember what it was, but it was certainly fairly heavy. The only thing I remember that I used to do hip thrusts, and I think I'd stopped doing that at like 20 weeks, like quite early. But other than that in the gym, it was pretty similar.
So nice to hear a really positive story, but is there any advice that you would now give to anybody else that's going through pregnancy that obviously isn't going to be competing at your level, but who does triathlon or is an endurance athlete in some capacity, and is trying to sort of balance the pregnancy and the fitness?
Yeah, I find it really difficult to think of things to kind of, that I wouldn't have done. I mean, potentially not run up until the day I gave birth was probably not the best idea, mainly because I pulled my calf. So I had a grade 2 tear the day I gave birth.
Oh, on the actual day? Oh no, I didn't know that.
I was like, once I'd given birth to Frederick, I was like hobbling around the hospital because I literally couldn't walk. So because that happened, I think, I should have probably stopped running maybe 2 weeks before. Just because your gait's so different, and obviously I was like 70 kilograms or more, I think, in the end. So that was probably not the best option. But other than that, I think it's really difficult. I just think listen to your own body, and nobody's the same. So obviously don't look at me as someone that's, to strive to do that much amount of exercise. You've just got to do what you can do and take it day by day, because literally everything changes. And the start of my pregnancy were completely different to the end of my pregnancy. And I think sometimes I could have stopped, but actually things got better. So it's really hard to kind of give advice, but it's mainly just listen to your own body. But I do think exercise and keeping fit has really helped with the birth and my pregnancy. But I've only got my own experience to go off, so I could have been just very lucky as well.
Well, my aim with this video was to trudge through the little evidence there is out there and speak to enough experts so that I could hopefully give you some idea of how to exercise whilst you're pregnant. But I cannot emphasise enough that we are all very different. So this is very much just a guide and sharing that info with you. But that leaves me just to say that whether it's yourself, it's your friend, your athlete or your partner, just wishing you the best of luck with this exciting journey ahead.